Assalamu alaikum and hi everyone. I'm Mariam and we'll be talking about the respiratory system. And so I've divided my videos into 4 parts and this is my first part. So this is basically what we're going to cover today. The gas exchange across alveolar capillary membrane, and then what is pulmonary circulation, what is ventilation, and what is perfusion. So let's talk about the lung anatomy for a bit. So the air will enter from your nose or your nasal cavity or your oral cavity or your mouth, and then down to your auditory tube, or we call it eustachian tube, down to your nasopharynx, your oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and down to your trachea. And so from your nose or your oral cavity, from your nasal cavity or your oral cavity down to your trachea is what we call as the upper airways. And then when you eat, the food that you chew will be, that's what we call as food bolus, will push a flap just behind the tongue. We call it an epiglottis, and this will seal off the entry to the trachea, which then causes the food bolus to move towards the esophagus. Alright, now we've talked about the upper airways, and now let's look at the lower part of the respiratory system. From the trachea down to your bronchi, down to your bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs. And so from your trachea down to your terminal bronchioles, we call that as the conducting zone. And from the respiratory bronchioles, your alveolar ducts and alveolar sacs, these are called the respiratory zone. What does that mean? Conducting zone and respiratory zone. It simply means that there's respiration going on in the conducting, and there's respiration going on in the respiratory zone, whereas in the conducting zone there is no respiration occurring. So when we say respiration, it simply means that there is gas exchange. So in the respiratory zone there is gas exchange, and there is none in the conducting zone. Okay, let's talk about the structure of the airways. Cartilage rings can be found in the trachea and bronchi. Smooth muscle found in the trachea, bronchi, and terminal bronchioles. So we know that the trachea and bronchi are the cartilaginous area, and the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles are non-cartilaginous. Right. Obstructive diseases of the lungs result from narrowing of the smaller bronchi and larger bronchioles. So example of obstructive disease are like asthma. So asthma is one of the obstructive disease of the lung. And then let's look at what are the defense mechanism in your airways. So one of them is having cilia of the cells. So we know that the cells are lined with cilia. So cilia are simply the kind of like brush border, and it will help prevent the foreign particles. I mean, if they do enter your airways, having the cilia will help push these foreign particles away and out from your airways. Secondly, we have mast cells. So mast cells are also involved in asthma patient, but naturally it will help prevent it is also one of the defense mechanism. Mast cell will initiate the immune system. And then we have lastly the goblet cells, which are located in between the cells lining your airways. So these goblet cells will be producing mucus, and so this mucus, a lot of them are being, a lot of mucus are being secreted, forming a layer we call as a mucosa layer, and this will also act as one of the defense mechanisms. Alright, another defense mechanism that your body has is the coughing. So it starts off with having an irritation in your body when foreign particles enter your airways, right? So your body has an irritation, and this leads to stimulation of the vagus nerve or cranial nerve number 10, and this will lead to the inspiration here. So as you inspire, the glottis will stay open, right? So after a while, the glottis starts to close slowly, and this will lead to build-up of pressure inside here. Pressure will start to build up inside here. So as the pressure increases slowly, and finally, when the pressure is really high, you have the contraction of the abdominal muscle walls and also the diaphragm. So this is the diaphragm, and the abdominal muscle wall is right here, right? So contraction of both of these muscles will force air out. Air from your lung cavity will be forced out, and this will force the glottis to open, and then you will have expulsion, and that's coughing, right? And so the abdominal muscle walls that are involved in coughing are the oblique muscles, the external and internal oblique muscles, and the rectus abdominis muscle. Alright, so basically here we want to look at a closer view of your lung. So if you zoom in into your lung, you will see that it's made up of tiny air sacs, or we call it alveolar sacs. And we've known that these alveolar sacs is one of the respiratory zone, right? And it means that gas exchange are occurring here, right? Now, if you look at the alveolar sacs, they are actually made up of alveolar cells, and we have two types of alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells and type 2 alveolar cells. So primarily they are made up of type 1 alveolar cells, and these alveolar cells are flat, and a few of them made one alveolus. And then you also have type 2 alveolar cells, and these type 2 alveolar cells are the one that secretes surfactant, and we will look at surfactant and its importance later in my other videos. Alright, now we're looking at pulmonary vessels, and here I've listed out three main blood vessels that are involved. The first one is pulmonary arteries, the second one is pulmonary veins, and the third one are the bronchial vessels. Right, the one that is particularly supplying the lung is from the bronchial vessels. Alright, and then the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins are simply the blood vessel that comes in and comes out, and that they are deoxygenated and oxygenated. So if you look at the term here, the arteries and the veins, particularly you learn that in generally in your heart, right? The blood vessels that comes out from your heart are called arteries, and the blood vessels that comes to your heart are called veins. So it's the other way around for your lung, right? So the one that comes to your lung are what we call as the pulmonary arteries, and the one that comes out from your lung is what we call as the veins. So this is a difference with the one in the heart, right? So the pulmonary arteries are thin and short, and the pulmonary veins are short, and it immediately empty blood into the left atrium. Alright, now you can see the a graph here that shows blood pressure, and it's comparing the pressure of blood in the aorta, and also the blood pressure in the right ventricle and pulmonary artery, right? So just to show you that the highest pressure can be found in the artery, in the aorta, which is the artery that is leaving the heart. Alright, here's just to show you how the lung is inside your chest cavity. So you have here, if you imagine the fist, your fist, and as you pushed into a balloon filled with fluid, you have that double layer created by doing that, right? So you have the inner layer, we call it the visceral pleura, and the outer layer, we call it the parietal pleura, and then inside you have the fluid, and your lung is inside those both layers. And then because the inside of this, in between this visceral and parietal pleura, it's filled with fluid, so your lung can expand and relax freely. Alright, now let's talk about the movement of gases. Now gases move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, and this is the gas law. So gases move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Right, what does it mean by higher concentration? It simply means there's more gases in a certain area, so you call that a higher concentration, or we call that a high partial pressure of that gas. So an area with low partial pressure, it means that there is low level of that gas in that area. So gases always move from a place where there is a lot of that gases, a higher concentration or a higher partial pressure, and it moves to the area with low partial pressure or low concentration or less gas, right? So in the alveoli here, it means that the your lung, right? So when I say alveoli, it refers to your lungs. So when we breathe in, you have a lot of oxygen in your lung, right? So, and then you have blood vessels also. Remember, we talk about the blood vessels are very close to the alveoli. So you have blood vessels in your lung. So these blood vessels are containing low oxygen because they just return from the rest of your body, and the rest of your body has taken all the oxygen and now it's low. It has low oxygen. But the oxygen in your lung is high. So therefore, the oxygen in your alveoli has got high partial pressure, and the oxygen in your blood has got low partial pressure. So particularly in the pulmonary blood. Pulmonary means in your lung. So the blood that is in your lung has got low oxygen, and the oxygen that is in your lung has got high oxygen. So the oxygen will move. Remember, it moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So therefore, it will move from alveoli to the blood. Right. Right, now let's look at the tissue. So in your tissue, you have, imagine the blood coming in from your lung. It goes down, it goes to your heart, and after that your heart pumps it to the rest of your body, right? So now the blood has got high concentration of oxygen, high partial pressure of oxygen. And in your tissue, you have got low partial pressure of oxygen because there's low oxygen. The tissues has used up the oxygen, right? So there's low oxygen in the tissue, but there's high in the blood. So therefore, where does the oxygen move? So the oxygen moves from the blood to the tissue, right? So these are the movement of the oxygen. Now let's talk about the carbon dioxide now. Now the carbon dioxide is interesting. It works. It is in contrast to the oxygen movement, right? Now let's go back to the tissue. All right, let's go back to the tissue. Now I'm gonna use a different color for carbon dioxide. Right, in the tissue, right, you have a lot of carbon dioxide, right? In the tissue, you have a lot of carbon dioxide. And the blood in the tissue has got low carbon dioxide because it's clean blood. It's coming from the heart and it's coming from the lung, and the lung has cleared the carbon dioxide away, and so the carbon dioxide is less in the blood but very, very high in the tissue, and therefore the movement of carbon dioxide is from the tissue to the blood, right? From tissue to the blood, right? And in the alveoli or in your lung here, where does carbon dioxide moves to, right? So now coming back to your lung, the blood that has got very high carbon dioxide travels to your lung so that your lung will remove the carbon dioxide from your body, right? So you have high carbon dioxide in the blood, and then in your lung, in your alveoli, there's low carbon dioxide, and so carbon dioxide will move from the pulmonary blood to the alveoli, and that's the movement of carbon dioxide, which is different from oxygen. Alright, so here we're going to talk about the Fick's law of diffusion. So it's a formula stating that the rate of diffusion is equivalent to the diffusion constant times area for gas exchange times the difference in partial pressure divided by the distance, which is the thickness of barrier to diffuse. Right, so let's talk about the diffusion constant first. So the oxygen and carbon dioxide has both their own diffusion constant. So the oxygen is a smaller molecule compared to carbon dioxide, but the carbon dioxide has got a higher solubility compared to oxygen, which means that the efficiency of diffusions is higher in carbon dioxide than oxygen, right? And that's something that we cannot change. But what we can change is the A here, the area for gas exchange, the partial pressure difference, and also the distance, right? So when we talk about the area for gas exchange in your lung, if you imagine we take the each alveolus, and we flatten them all out, you have a large surface area, and this is very, very efficient in respiration, and so your lung has got that. We all have that, right? And then partial pressure difference, right? So remember we talk about gas law, and we did say that if there's a higher concentration in an area compared to the other area, so the gas will move from a higher concentration area to a lower concentration area. So the higher the difference in partial pressure of gas, the rate of diffusion will be more, right? So an increased rate of diffusion. And then inversely for the distance, right? So if there is a long way to go, say you have a lower rate of diffusion. All right, so if you have less, for example, the value here is very, very small, means there is less distance for the air to travel, then you have an increased rate of diffusion. So that's how you use this formula to see the rate of diffusion of a gas. Okay, here you can see the blood-air barrier. So the blood-air barrier consists of three things. Okay, so the first thing is the epithelium of the alveolar and epithelium of the blood capillary. So remember that the previously I've mentioned that the blood vessels and the alveolus are very, very close to one another, and this reduces the distance of air travel. So the the gases does not have to travel very far, right? So it's very close to one another. So and the barrier that the gas has to go through are what we call as the blood-air barrier, and it consists of all of these three. So you have the alveolus epithelium and the extracellular matrix, and then the capillary endothelium. Alright, this picture, this diagram is just to show you the difference between systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation, and what it means by it, right? So systemic circulation is the circulation between the heart and to the rest of your body. So basically it involves the heart, right? Heart and the rest of the body. Right, so it delivers blood to all body cells and carry away waste. Whereas in pulmonary circulation is where you eliminate carbon dioxide and oxygenate your blood, right? So this is between the heart and the lung. So that's why it's called pulmonary. So whenever there's pulmonary, it basically means lung. Alright, here we are seeing a graph and a diagram that shows you the diffusion of oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries. Right, in this diagram, I'm just showing you one capillary and one alveolus, and then you can see that at the arterial end, I've put there PO2, partial pressure of oxygen is equivalent to 40 millimeter mercury, and you have at the end partial pressure of oxygen of 104 millimeter mercury. So right, and I've put here the question here, what is the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial end? So the answer is here is 40, right? And the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous end is 104. Right, so remember the gas law that says that the gases moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Right, now you can see that in the blood, pulmonary blood, right, you have a 40 millimeter mercury partial pressure of oxygen. This is a concentration. It means that the amount of oxygen is low, right? Now inside the lung, so particularly here alveolus, right, it refers to your lung in general. Now your alveolus partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeter mercury. So again, let me just point it out to you. So in your blood, partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeter mercury, which is lower than the partial pressure of oxygen in your lung, alveolus, which is 104, right? So now you see the difference, right? The difference in the partial pressure. So remember when I said earlier about gas law that the gas move from a higher concentration to low concentration, right? So basically the movement of oxygen here is from alveolus to the blood, right? Because there's lower oxygen in the blood, so therefore the oxygen moves from the lung to the blood. This is at the arterial end, right? Right. Now this one is continuous, so this movement of oxygen will continue until the end of the capillary, until the concentration of both areas are the same. So if there is equivalent concentration of oxygen in the blood and in the lung, only then there will be no more movement, right? But actually in reality there will still be movement, but it will be the same. like if 2 molecules of oxygen moves in, there will be 2 molecules of oxygen moving out. So hence the net of movement will come to 0, right? Right, so finally you have at the end of the day, you have the same concentration of oxygen in both lung and blood. So look at the end of the capillary of the blood, you have partial pressure of oxygen 104, which is similar to the partial pressure of oxygen in the lung, labeled here alveolus, right? So the movement of oxygen is continuous up till the concentration of both areas become the same, right? So if you look at the graph here, you can see that the concentration slowly increases, right? So it starts off with 40 here, and as it moves toward the venous end, you can see that the pressure, the level of oxygen slowly builds up because of the partial pressure gradient, right? So now it's got the same, and towards the end you have partial pressure of oxygen the same with the one in the lung. Alright, so here we basically want to see the changes in the partial pressure of oxygen in the cardiovascular system. So what it means here is that the changes in the oxygen concentration or oxygen level in different areas, okay, such as this one, you can see that here the graph is the level is at 40 millimeter mercury partial pressure of oxygen in the systemic venous blood. This is the one that returns from the body, from the rest of the tissues, and then coming back to the heart, and the heart will from the heart pumps to the lung through the pulmonary capillaries. So you can see in the pulmonary capillaries that there is an increase in the level of oxygen from 40 to 100. This is where the blood vessels, the deoxygenated blood will become oxygenated, and at the end of the capillaries, the venous end will be blood with oxygen, high level of oxygen, and this is where the pulmonary capillaries will empty out the blood to the heart, and then from the heart it will start to deliver the blood to the rest of the body again. So you can see that these from 100 you have slightly lower here, and then finally this is from the heart, and from the heart to the systemic. Systemic here means to the rest of the body tissues. We call it systemic capillaries. And then again back to the systemic venous blood. This is going back from the body tissues to the heart again, right? So here there's a mix with pulmonary shunt blood. So remember that previously we've talked about the 3 types when we talk about the blood vessels, that there are 3 types: the pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, and then there's the blood vessels that supplies the lung, right? So this is the blood that supplies the lung. It joins the blood that comes out from the pulmonary pulmonary capillaries, which is the vein, right? So the vein, it travels back to the heart, and so this blood from supplying the lung will also join in the blood that comes from the pulmonary, the one that gets oxygenated, and will join this one and goes to the heart, and the heart will pump to the rest of the body. So there's a mix with pulmonary shunt blood. Yes, okay, so now we're talking about the diffusion of oxygen in systemic capillaries and tissues. So remember, when it comes down from the heart, the blood that comes out is the blood with a lot of oxygen. So you can see here, the blood that is from the heart has got a high level of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen here is 95 millimeter mercury. And in the tissues, notice that the level of oxygen is very, very low. And if you compare with the one that has just reached the tissues, is 95, and the one in the tissues is about 23 and 40. So there is a whole lot of difference in the partial pressure, and therefore the partial pressure difference will cause the movement of oxygen from the blood into the tissue, right? So it goes into the tissue. So as the blood moves along, the blood vessels, more and more oxygen will continue to diffuse out. Okay, it is continue to diffuse out, and all of this oxygen, as long as there is a difference in the partial pressure, difference in the concentration of oxygen in the blood and in the tissues, there will be movement of oxygen, right? And when finally the concentration in the tissue and in the blood is equivalent, then there is no more oxygen going out, right? So at the end of the here at the venous end, you can see that the level of oxygen is now equivalent to the one that is in the tissue, because the tissues and the cells are using it, right? Using oxygen. That is why the oxygen level has now decreased. So here is the venous end of the capillary, and as you can see that the level of oxygen has now reduced to 40, right? And this is the one that travels back to the heart and to the lung for more oxygen. Okay. All right, now let's talk about the movement of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries. So when we say pulmonary capillaries, it's referring to the lung. So in the lung, you have the blood vessels that comes in is the artery, right? Pulmonary artery that comes in into the lung, and this blood that comes into the lung has got a lot of carbon dioxide. It has just arrived, it has just picked up a lot of carbon dioxide along the way in the systemic circulation, in the blood, in the body tissues, right? So now it is returning, and it has a high carbon dioxide level here. As you can see, it's 45 millimeter mercury. And in the lung, when you say lung, so you look at the alveolus partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it's only 40 millimeter mercury. So if you compare it with the one returning from the whole body, you have the level of carbon dioxide 45 millimeter mercury. So there's a difference. There's a 5 millimeter mercury difference in the partial pressure. So now you can see that the movement of the carbon dioxide goes from the blood to the alveolus, meaning from the blood to the lung, right? And this one will continue through the rest of the capillaries until the concentration is similar, until the concentration of both areas are the same. So you have at the end of the day, okay, here at the end of this blood vessels, this is at the venous end. So now you can see that the level of carbon dioxide is the same with the level of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the lung, right? So it has moved into the lung. So now that the carbon dioxide moves into the lung will remove the carbon dioxide out when you exhale, right? So here's below here there's a graph showing you the level of the carbon dioxide along this blood vessel. So you can see that in the earlier end, you have a 45 millimeter mercury, and then it goes down to 40, right? So it goes down. So you can see that the graph basically goes down, showing you that the level is also decreasing. Alright, now this is to show you the diffusion of carbon dioxide in the systemic capillaries and tissues. And as you can see that the blood that has just been pumped out from your heart is fresh blood with very little or less carbon dioxide, so it's at 40 millimeter mercury, and the level of carbon dioxide in the tissue, as you can see here, is only about 46 and 45. So there's a different here, right? About 5 or 6 millimeter mercury difference. So the partial pressure difference will cause movement of carbon dioxide from the tissue to the blood, and this will continue until the level of carbon dioxide in the blood and in the tissue is equivalent. So at the end of the day, you have the same level of carbon dioxide in the blood and in the tissues. As you can see here, now it's 45 millimeter mercury, which is the same with the one in the tissues, right? Notice that the range of partial pressure range of carbon dioxide is very small compared to the range of partial pressure of oxygen. So partial pressure of oxygen, previously we saw that it's from 40 millimeter mercury in the tissues, and in the lung you've got up to 100 to 104 millimeter mercury, right? So there's a big range of oxygen level, whereas for carbon dioxide level, only a small range, so 40 to 45, right? So why the small range? It's because our body cannot tolerate toxicity, and carbon dioxide cannot be too high, as it will lead to toxicity in your body, and that's dangerous for humans. And so that's why our body tries to maintain that the maximum level of carbon dioxide to be at 45 or 46 millimeter mercury only, and not more than that. Okay, now here we have a graph that shows you ventilation and perfusion, right? And then there's another graph which is the combination of ventilation perfusion, right? So you can see here ventilation here, right? This is the ventilation graph, right? And you can see here is the area, the region of the lung. So this one is the base of the lung, and this is the apex of the lung, right? So base here means the bottom part of the lung, and the apex here is the top part of the lung. So as you can see, if you can imagine the lung in an upright position, you have a higher ventilation in the base, and then a lower ventilation at the apex of the lung. And then looking at the blood flow, so when you talk about blood flow refers to the perfusion, the blood that reaches alveoli. So blood flow in the at the base of the lung is really high compared to the apex of the lung, where it's really low. This one, right? Imagine that the blood is when you're standing upright, and blood flowing, and of course because of gravity you have blood, a lot more blood at the bottom part compared to the upper part, and that is why the base part of the lung has got a higher blood flow compared to the apex. And so if you plot another graph, blood flow and ventilation. So in order for to show that the efficiency of respiration, you have to have a certain blood flow that tallies with a certain ventilation, right? So it's a waste of air if it's not if there's not enough blood to help to transfer the oxygen or transport the oxygen or the carbon dioxide. And similarly, if you have a lot of blood flow but there's no air coming in, so you're wasting blood as well, right? So you want to have the same blood flow with an equivalent ventilation so that your respiration will be at the optimum level. Okay, so if you plot that graph, you can see here, this is the one. At the base level, you can see that there's a higher blood flow compared to ventilation. So this is underventilated or shunt-like. And if you look at the upper part here, the apex of the lung area, you have a higher ventilation compared to blood flow, compared to perfusion. Therefore, you call it the overventilated, or we call it alveolar, that space, right? So that space here means there's a lot of ventilation, but there's no perfusion. So it doesn't matter if you have a lot of oxygen being supplied, because then you need to, for that oxygen to be transported to the tissues, right? But we don't have that. So this is what it means. Okay. Right, so when we look at the ventilation and perfusions at different areas, so in this diagram, you can see that there are different zones in your lung. So this is your lung upright, and you can see that there are 3 zones. So the upper part, zone one, and then you have zone 2 and zone 3, and in each zone there's a difference in the partial pressure of arterial partial pressure, of the vein partial pressure, and also the alveolus, right? So this PA, this big PA here, P and a big letter A, refers to the partial pressure of the alveolus. So as you can see in zone 1, the partial pressure of alveolus is very, very high compared to the partial pressure of artery and the partial pressure of vein, and therefore you have a very big size of alveolus there. And this is where in this area you have we were talking about, there's a lot of ventilation compared to perfusion. As you can see, there's a very small blood vessels going through this highly ventilated area, right? Highly ventilated area. Okay, now in zone 2, you'll see that there's highest partial pressure is at the partial pressure of the artery, pulmonary artery. So you can see that the partial pressure of alveolus is less than that of artery. So it's smaller in size compared to the one in zone 1. And the least partial pressure is in the vein. And then in zone 3, you have partial pressure of artery, the biggest, followed by partial pressure of vein, and also the partial pressure of the alveolus, the smallest. So you can see that the size of the alveolus in zone 3 is the smallest here. Zone 3 consists of a smaller alveolus. Therefore, you're saying that it's where there's higher perfusion but less ventilation, right? Alright, here's just to show you the difference in the lung, right? In normal people and people with problem, people with disease or abnormalities, right? So in A, you can see that there's normal distribution and normal perfusion, right? So normal distribution and normal perfusions, usually we have zone 2 and zone 3. So normally in healthy people, will have only zone 2 and zone 3, right? We don't have zone 1. Remember, zone 1 is the one with high ventilation but low perfusion, right? And then in B here, you can see that there's an increased cardiac output. So you can see there is an increase in zone 3 because of the increase in cardiac output. Increased cardiac output here means there is an increase in blood flow. So that's why you can see that there's a high zone 3 compared to the one in A. Now in C, where you have a decreased cardiac output, this is the opposite of B. So you have a reduced blood flow, and you can see now there is zone 1 here appearing, right? And in D, you have increased vascular resistance, pulmonary vascular resistance, without an increase in cardiac output, which is similar to C, right? If you have an obstruction in your lung, for example, this will cause resistance, and with resistance, if it's not being supported by an increased cardiac output, you will get similar results as in C as well, right? Again, this is just to show you ventilation and perfusion, and this diagram is just showing okay, the first one here, we just change my color, right? The first one here, this one is where as you can see, there is perfusion, right? There's blood flow here, you can see there's perfusion, but there's a blockage here, right? There's a blockage here, so there's no ventilation. So we're saying that this one has got no ventilation, but there is perfusion, right? So you have the level of carbon dioxide 45, and the level of oxygen is 40. 40 means it is very, very low. It's low, right? But you have a high carbon dioxide because the blood is coming back, and the carbon dioxide is here, but it's not being released, right? It stays here, you cannot go out, and the oxygen also cannot be entering here because of the blockage, right? So oxygen level remains at 40, remains low. Now in the second picture, this is the normal situation, normal condition, where you can see that there's no blockage of airway, and there's no blockage in the blood vessel. So you can see that there's perfusion and there's ventilation, right? So you have a low level of carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is being released as soon as the blood with high carbon dioxide enters. It will diffuse out, and then finally we exhale it out. And then you have oxygen, a high level, because we breathe in oxygen, and oxygen is being used, and oxygen is being transferred into the blood and get transported to the rest of your body, right? So you have this is good, right? And in the last picture, you can see here there is blockage in the blood vessels, so which means that there's no perfusion, but there's no blockage here, right? There's no blockage here, so this means that there is ventilation, but there's no perfusion. So because of that, you have the level of carbon dioxide 0, right? Because the blood that has got high level of carbon dioxide returns but cannot be released into the lung, right? Because of the blockage. And oxygen is really, really high because of the ventilation is available, right? It's not blocked, so you have plenty of air coming in, so plenty of oxygen here. Okay, now let's talk about minute respiratory volume. So this is the total amount of new air being moved into the respiratory passages each minute. So here's the formula that I've typed out for you. So the minute respiratory volume is equivalent to the tidal volume times the respiratory rate. And tidal volume is the normal volume of air that we breathe in and out. when we're not doing anything at rest. So when we say at rest, meaning if you're not doing anything, the amount of air that you breathe in and out, and that's what we call as the tidal volume. So this is usually on average is at 500 mil. And then you have a respiratory rate. Respiratory rate here is the how many breaths that you breathe, how many breaths per minute, right? So, and usually it's about 12 breaths. So if you times 500 times 12 breaths per minute, you have about 6 liters per minute. Alright, so now we're talking about the alveolar ventilation. So the key area to bring new air is into the alveoli, where there is gas exchange. Remember that gas exchange only occurs at the respiratory zone, and the alveolus, which is the alveolar sacs, or at the alveolar duct or at the respiratory bronchioles, are the areas of respiration, right? And then the air that does not reach the respiratory zone, that does not go through gas exchange, is the area that we call dead space, right? So these dead space are divided into two. So there is anatomic dead space, and there's physiologic dead space. So when we talk about anatomic, we're talking about location. So the area where the air is in, but it cannot be exchanged. For example, in the conducting zone, you have air there. Definitely there will be air where there is no gas exchange. For example, in the in the nose, for example, or in the pharynx, right, or in the trachea, or in the bronchioles, right? So there are no gas exchange occurring there. So therefore, these are all the air that is what we call as dead space air. Whereas there's physiologic dead space air is when for example, previously we've talked about the ventilation and perfusion, right? Where there is ventilation, but there's less perfusion, and because of that air being there but not being involved in gas exchange, and it's where it can be used for gas exchange, but because there's blockage, for example, then there is no gas exchange. So that becomes physiologic dead space. And normally the amount of that space in a normal healthy adult is about 150 mil. Alright, now finally there's alveolar ventilation per minute, and using this formula you just have to put in the value, and we have discussed the values earlier in the previous slide. So just put in the tidal volume and minus the dead space volume, and then I've already told you the rate of respiration per minute, so times with that, and then you will finally get the volume of alveolar ventilation per minute. And with that, that's the end of my first video, and we'll talk more on respiratory system in my next video. See you next time. Assalamualaikum. Bye bye.